India Independence Bill 1947 describes creation of two dominions under the British Queen, King or Queen. Two dominions under the British King or Queen. So please remember that its actual constitutional meaning is, with all the struggle for independence, what happened in 1947 was de facto, we accepted dominion status. Our true Independence Day is January 26. Tolerance is inbuilt in Indian civilization. If secularism is understood as freedom of religion, if secularism is understood as equal respect for all religions, because they are understood as different paths to reach the same God, Indian understanding is way deeper than Western evolution of secularism. Hope you enjoyed the first lecture, because most of you know that unless you enjoy, I don't. And then you know the consequences if I don't enjoy something that is going on. So here is lecture 2. The exact title is Evolving Constitution in Pre-Independence Days. Pre-Independence Days, years, time. Somehow my mind reminded me of correcting one mistake. I am drawing your attention to one inadvertent kind of mistake in the first lecture. So I am just drawing your attention and asking you to correct it. I mentioned Granville Austin as British writer. But he is not British, he is American. Someone may say it's potato, because it is Anglo-Saxon, so to say, the culture, civilization, etc. But by and large, Americans are not as anti-India as Britishers are. That translates into institutional approaches also, that I am very clear that BBC is anti-India, CNN isn't. I could go on narrating British political thinkers or historians of India who have by and large written colonial interpretation of Indian history, while I could go on showing you American political or historical writers and thinkers who are better disposed towards India. For example, you have Stanley Woolpert writing like History of India, even History of Modern India or History of Partition. He comes down so heavily on British colonial rule. I wonder whether it has to do something with the fact that Stanley Woolpert is an American historian thinker. US mind itself is almost naturally disposed against colonialism. So whether that translates into making of an individual mind who gets born and brought up in the same system can be kind of understood, so to say. So Granville Austin, who really explains Indian Constitution ever so well, it's my pleasure to repeat that among handful of Indian thinkers and activists who are as outstanding as Granville Austin, I can think of like 2 or 3. Subhash Kashyap, Nani Palkhiwala, Fali Nariman, maybe a couple of other names. I'm not disrespectful towards anybody else. But Granville Austin helps us understand Indian Constitution in like one of the most outstanding fashions. So I thought this correction should be stated. Now, the Constitution which we have today is not like 292 members sat together sometime before 1947, and then most of the times after 1947 beginning with February 1947 to November 26, 1949. It's not like these 292 sat together, had like over 150 sessions discussing the constitution, prepared the document, and here is our constitution. That's not how the constitutions get prepared. That's not how the constitutions come into being. It's not like somebody sits down and prepares a charter and asks the society, the people, the country to adopt, enact, and give unto ourselves on this date of like November 26, 1949. A constitution has to be a natural outgrowth of a given society, its own norms of living. By and large, the customs that come into being as a product of historical experiences. So, constitution is an organic growth. The Constituent Assembly shaped that organic growth into a cohesive document which today runs our country, the document called the Constitution. So even Indian Constitution as of now is an outgrowth of, by and large, our freedom struggle. I am making a choice of my words very carefully. I am not saying our constitution is an outgrowth of British conquest of India. I am not saying our constitution is an outgrowth of British rule of India. I am saying our constitution is a natural outgrowth of the freedom struggle. So now when we are out to understand how our constitution evolved in pre-independence days, it actually means it's a slice of our freedom struggle from constitutional and statutory point of view. How gradually the medieval India, the quasi-feudal India I would describe it as, transformed into modern India with modern institutions, the modern institutions of democracy, rule of law, modern administration, modern judiciary, modern policies of education, this modernmost of the institution called press, and so on and so forth, including finally the awareness of the British way of rule, that they call it the parliament, that people vote and elect their representatives who then run the country as per the wishes of the people. So through all this, Indian constitution came into being. More and deeper we understand that, our insight into the constitution will be deeply ingrained. So it's a process of that historical phenomenon. That too is not like Britishers brought the concept of constitution. Sometimes some thinkers say so. I'm sorry, I disagree. I'm not sorry, I disagree. If we understand constitution as written set of rules which are required to be followed by even the ruling class, if we understand constitution as like written or unwritten but agreed set of rules by which the society abides, the whole society, it won't be wrong to say that India, for thousands of years of our history, we have always had, at each point of time, something that can be described as the constitution. Indian word for the constitution is, the original word is dharma / dhamma. Dharma is the Sanskrit word, Dhamma will be the Prakrit word. As I always keep saying, there is no exact English word for both the terms. They mean one and the same. Again, some thinkers might try to tell us how they are different. They are not different. It's not like somebody founds a dharma. What somebody founds, establishes, is a pantha, a path. Dharma are natural principles that govern individuals living and our collective living together also. So there is nobody invents dharma. All that rishis do is to discover the principles of dharma. Dharma has so many meanings, one of which is justice. All Indian languages, including of course Sanskrit and Prakrit, use the term dharma. Something wrong happened, injustice happened. Our description is adharma jhala. It's adharma jhala. Or somebody behaved in a wrong way. Or somebody wants to say that injustice happened. We say adharma jhala. Or we say ha काय dharma jhala काय. Asa asa waglas ha काय dharma jhala काय. Dharma stands for justice, which is an end, the objective. Dharma also stands for law, which is means to achieve that objective. Dharma is law. There is Raja Dharma. So Raja Dharma means the set of rules that the ruling class is required to follow. And Bharatiya Raja Dharma always stated that the job of the ruling class is to be equal to all, that the rulers should look upon people as their own sons and daughters, that rulers should be taking care of people like they would take care of their own sons and daughters. The very concept of freedom of religion is eternally enshrined in Bharatiya civilization, and so also the concept of dharma. Dharma is supposed to be eternal, shashvat. As per the changing times, there is an inbuilt concept in Indian civilization that we need smriti, mind you. Smriti can be understood as the constitution. That times change, so we need to change, and as per changing times, new smritis are required to be written. Shrutis, that is Vedas, are supposed to be eternal, and they are supposed to be anadi ananta. They don't have a beginning, and there is no end. And Vedas are also supposed to be apaurusheya. It's not like any single person created those Vedas. Nobody created Vedas. They are there. Only the principles were found, and rishis, who are then called mantra drashte, the seers, the visionaries, who only presented it for us. That is supposed to be eternal. But according to changing times of the society, sages who live their pure life, which is selflessly committed to welfare of the people, they are supposed to write smritis. So there is Yajnavalkya Smriti. Timing is always a problem with Indian history, so we cannot really pin down, but Yajnavalkya Smriti can be broadly supposed to be like 1 or 2 centuries just before Buddha and Mahavir. In 7th, 8th century, Yajnavalkya Smriti is found to be existing. Later on, much maligned Manusmriti, which defines position of a person based on birth. So that is Jati Vyavastha, Jati, the caste system. And then we have Narada Smriti, and there is Bruhasmriti Smriti. In the lines of Smritis, the last one that we find is Devala Smriti, sometime in 8th century. Because Devala Smriti is supposed to be after the Arabic invasion of Sindh. And when Arabs brought about forcible convergence to Islam, Devala Smriti has a chapter on bringing those people back into, you can say, the Vedic or the Hindu fold or whatever. So those conversions were forcible. Otherwise, in a traditional Indian civilization, so to say, again, Hindu, Buddha, whatever, there is no concept of proselytization, and that my truth is the only truth, and my God is the only God, and you better accept it or I'm going to kill you. And by asking you to follow my God, I'm actually doing you a favor, and in spite of my best efforts to extend this favor, you still don't accept, I'm going to kill you. There is no Indian concept. Tolerance is inbuilt in Indian civilization. If secularism is understood as freedom of religion, if secularism is understood as equal respect for all religions, because they are understood as different paths to reach the same God. Indian understanding is way deeper than Western evolution of secularism. That has always been there. Even when we begin to take a look at the modern times, and after unfortunate and tragic British conquest of India, and when Britishers started thinking of imposing modern European, especially British law on India, in their wisdom too, they thought it necessary to study Indian heritage and maybe combine or synthesize the modern, Western, especially British. There is a slight difference between British perception of law and European perception of law and justice. What the Britishers brought was essentially British perception of law. But while ruling India, they made it a point to synthesize their understanding of Indian heritage. For example, when Macaulay was asked to prepare law for India, he studied Mitakshara. Mitakshara, written by Vijnaneshwara, who is supposed to belong to Vidarbha region. Vijnaneshwara is supposed to be living near Akola, at Akola of present times. Vijnaneshwara wrote a commentary on Yajnavalkya Smriti. Mitakshara was written in 11th century. Macaulay based Indian Penal Code on his study of Mitakshara on one side and Sharia on the other hand. That after, you can call it Islamic invasions or you can call them Arabic, Turkish, etc. if you are like eager to avoid the communal tinge, which sadly is unavoidable, because whatever one says and interprets, the invasions were in the name of Islam. They were not just territorial invasions for expansion of empire and capture of loot. They were invasions in the name of a way of life, and with a conviction that we are going to impose this way of life on you and we are going to destroy your existing way of life which has been there for like thousands of years. But then Muslim society in India was governed by Sharia, and Hindu society throughout India was then governed by Mitakshara by and large. That is also one feature in even pre-7th century India, that throughout India there may be different kings and dynasties and different kingdoms, but most of them were governed by some common uniform set of rules most of the times. One such outstanding Smriti ever to be mentioned, remembered and carefully studied is indeed Chanakya's Arthashastra. These 3 or 4 Smritis, Yajnavalkya Smriti, Manu Smriti, Narada Smriti, and the last in the line, like I said, Devala Smriti and Chanakya's Arthashastra, have a deep impact on the statecraft in India before Islamic invasions began. And even after they began, the functioning of Hindu society, that included Buddha, Jain, etc., was essentially governed by, like I said, Mitakshara, and Muslim society was governed by Sharia. Macaulay made it a point to take both into consideration and synthesize that with the British law, enter Indian Penal Code. So the concept of Dharma/Dhamma with the changing times created Smritis, which can indeed be understood as informal, so to say, constitutions of like ancient and larger part of the medieval times. Then whether I like it or not doesn't matter. Historical facts are historical facts, that the Britishers conquered India, that we let them conquer India. Because sadly enough, we forgot the idea of India, and the vision became stunted to one's own kingdom and protecting one's own chair, and in the process we fought amongst ourselves, letting Westerners get the better of us. Therefore, The genesis of evolution of modern Indian constitution takes us back to establishment of East India Company. Y stands for Yajnavalkya. M stands for Manusmriti. N will be Narada Smriti. D here will be Devala Smriti. Among them, I made it a point to mention especially Chanakya's A for Arthashastra. Out of which on Yajnavalkya Smriti, Vijnaneshwara wrote commentary named as Mitakshara, which was used by Macaulay to draft Indian Penal Code. It so happens that it's pretty easy to remember when East India Company was founded, because it is December 1600. Europe had already begun a process of voyages of discovery, and the age of Renaissance and then Reformation had brought about what is aptly described as age of reason. And Europe had already started developing modern instruments of science and technology and modern political evolution of like institutions of democracy, judiciary, even press. So the printing press in 16th century Germany spreading pretty fast throughout Europe. So Europe was equipped with all modern equipments. That is what created age of Europe really, truly. And if we say that USA and USSR were superpowers of the world like until 1991 when USSR vanished, etc., until China begins to rise, and I am convinced India has begun to rise, remains to be seen how long it will take. But age of Europe continues because American civilization, and in fact starting with Peter the Great, even Russian civilization is essentially European civilization. So the ideas, the institutions that were born in Europe spread all over the world. One such is this trade and commerce throughout the world. And in fact, Britishers are among the last ones to join, because there already was a Dutch East India Company, which eventually established its empire in what is now known as Indonesia. There already was a French East India Company, which eventually established its empire, which was then known as Indochina, which is now known as Vietnam, Cambodia, Laos together. In fact, this was mutual understanding among European trade and commerce companies. There is a global struggle for power between especially the British and the French. That struggle also unfolded on our territory. So we have Anglo-French wars or Carnatic wars in around 1750s, and then Plassey, etc., etc. So the Britishers are in fact the last one to join this race to establish empire all over the world through trade and commerce. Queen Elizabeth I initiated the process to establish East India Company, the British East India Company. Original shareholders were 72. And Queen Elizabeth gave the charter of trade in the Eastern Hemisphere. East India Company was given the monopoly rights of trade and commerce in the Eastern Hemisphere. Then in terms of understanding the evolution of our constitution, there is hardly anything happening between 1600 to 1757. I find that this is also a period when in fact Britain itself was undergoing cataclysmic changes. Most of history is always benefit of hindsight. So with benefit of hindsight, you can read a pattern and establish a defining theme of a given period of history. So you can say that between 1600 to 1757, Britain itself was working on itself. Therefore, creation of parliament, but struggle over division of powers between the parliament, the struggle between the king, so Charles I and the parliament. Therefore, the British Civil War from 1648 to 1664. This was also known as Bloody Revolution. The only time Britain tried to be a republic. A republic means where the highest head of state is not hereditary. That is the only time Britain tried to be a republic. But the constitutional monarchy was re-established in 1688. Charles II brought back and re-established as the king, but Charles II also agreed that by and large the king or the queen, Britain follows what is known as principle of primogeniture. Principle of primogeniture means firstborn will be the heir, the successor. We need to understand that the British ruling dynasty, which is same as what it was then, it's Hanover dynasty, the name is Hanover dynasty, including current Prince William and Harry, depending on how far you envy him because he got Meghan Markle. All belong to the Hanover dynasty, same as Queen Elizabeth I. British ruling dynasty follows the principle of primogeniture, not the principle of male primogeniture. That clearly needs to be understood. It's the firstborn. Whoever is the first. If the firstborn happens to be a girl, then she will be the queen. Her husband will not be the king. She will be the king. If the firstborn is male, then that person will go on to be the king. So you have creation of constitutional monarchy after 1688. And the British common law, which develops into an unwritten, informal but universally accepted constitution for Britain, evolves beyond that. And evolution of parliament as an institution, which in the first lecture I explained, Montesquieu misread and thought as division of powers between legislature, executive and judiciary. It wasn't there, but the institutions evolved later on. So until 1757, even Britain is working on its own institutions. British law is a consequence of Roman law. And Roman law has evolved in somewhat different ways on the continent of Europe. Now, Roman law, as it evolved differently on the continent of Europe, is codified in the Napoleonic Code. Napoleon conferred this code around 1802. It's a great code. It is based on the continental interpretation of ancient Roman law. British law evolved slightly differently because it combines the interpretation of Roman law with British common law. When it comes to India, it is that what comes to India. Therefore, eventually you will find that Indian political institutions assume slightly different formats as we go on studying that. So by and large, the period from 1600 to 1757 can only be said to be defined on the point I just mentioned. The century from 1757 to 1857 begins to bring initial political, constitutional, statutory institutions in existence. Unfortunately, again, negatively thanks to the Battle of Plassey 1757. Also the same decade saw Anglo-Karnataka wars, which allowed British East India Company to establish a foothold in Madras then, and the French were already there in Pondicherry, and wherever European colonial rulers were ruling, they brought their law over there. It's like 1660s. I think the year is 1667. Until 1667, the island then known as Bombay was owned by the Portuguese. There, Princess Catherine of Braganza was married off to the British prince. The island of Bombay was given over as dowry, and this is how Bombay became a British base. But immediately after 1660s, the Britishers, that is East India Company over there, had already established a British court there in Mumbai. And that court had already begun functioning on the lines of British law. So that can be said to be in like selected pockets over there. It so happens that in 1757, East India Company became the ruler of a substantial part of the country. Initial idea was East India Company will have a ruler who undertakes pro-East India Company policies. So, this Sangeet Khurchi between like Siraj-ud-Dawla defeated by treachery by his military general Mir Jafar, then Mir Qasim, and then the real battle that happened is 1764 Buxar. It is after Buxar that the Mughal emperor issued a charter of collecting taxes in the name of East India Company. East India Company became the Mughal Sardar, the Mughal ruler of province of Bengal. And you will see that the evolution of modern institutions begins. East India Company established courts, brought in law. Again, for example, one of the most illustrious examples, William Jones, the father of modern linguistics, was a city magistrate in Calcutta in 1776. And sitting there as a judge, when he listened to Bengali speak this beautiful language Bengali, and he found the sounds to be uncannily similar to most of European languages. It was his modern intellectual approach which made him study different languages in a comparative fashion. This is how linguistics was born. But after Buxar of 1764, you will find that already the British courts were there in Kolkata, also Madras, also as it was called Bombay then. So the modern evolution then begins. You will see the modern educational principles were sought to be brought into effect from 1835. Macaulay's Note on Indian Education is 1835. The famous one that says that the goal should be to create Europeans in culture, taste, etc., but with the black or brown skin, to build an army of clerks for perpetuation of British rule of India. Macaulay's educational policy. And as the British rule gradually spread, all modern law, which then evolves into modern constitution, begins to come in. As per the British law, the East India Company used to receive Charter of Trade once every 20 years. The idea was the Charter of Trade, that was not for all times to come. The British Queen or King would issue a Charter of Trade once every 20 years. You will find that until 1813, the charters were simply renewed as a matter of routine. But after Buxar, the British Parliament realized that now East India Company, a company, mind you, a company. It's important to understand that until 1774, 73-74, there was no parliamentary control on functioning of British East India Company. But when after Buxar the Parliament woke up to the reality that here is a British company which now controls a substantial part, it's a big territory and that properly needs to be governed. Therefore the Parliament sat together and effected, which is famously known as the Regulating Act of 1773-4. If you remember the history and developments after 1773-4, you will actually feel surprised to note the defining features of the Regulating Act. Regulating Act, as the name says, establishes parliamentary supervision, not yet control. Remember, not yet control, but it is parliamentary supervision. The concept, for the first time, East India Company was made answerable to the Parliament, and two of the governing members were to be appointed to the board of directors. But East India Company was still de facto autonomous, still answerable only to its own shareholders. So there was parliamentary supervision. You will also be surprised to note that Regulating Act forbids any further expansion of empire, forbids East India Company from undertaking any further wars of conquest without the permission of the Parliament, of course. You will actually see that almost all wars of conquest undertaken by East India Company are predominantly after 1773-74. I am expecting you to remember that the first Anglo-Maratha war itself commenced in the right earnest from 1774. And it went on till 1782. Second Anglo-Maratha War is 1802-3, and the third and the saddest and unfortunate Anglo-Maratha War is 1817-18 in 3 battles, end of Maratha Empire. And similarly you have the Sikh Empire, Anglo-Sikh War consisting of 3 battles. And there is Anglo-Burmese War. There are 2 Anglo-Burmese wars. There are 3 Anglo-Afghan wars. And so on and so forth. Is it like East India Company sought the Parliament's permission every time? The answer is no. That is more thanks to the system of communication and transport as it existed then. Because for one letter to be written, the letter to reach, and British government to decide, take a position, then write a letter and send it over here, average time would be 6 months. Within those 6 months, British East India Company in India would have scored even further successes. All they would do is report these wars of conquest. And every time all that the British Parliament would do is like regularize, accept that it's on the ground fait accompli, and accordingly issue instructions to East India Company. So, Regulating Act. Then in another less than 10 years, there is Pitt's India Act, 1782. Is it 82 or 84? Yeah. Pitt's India Act of 1784. Pitt's India Act begins to now establish the British control over there. Regulating Act had already created 3 administrative units respectively at Kolkata, Bombay, Madras. Each one was independently ruled, each one had a governor, and each one was answerable to the board of directors sitting there in London. Then was created the post of Governor General. And the sitting governor in Kolkata was then made into Governor General. This was Warren Hastings, who under the law became the first Governor General, and other two governors were brought under his control. They were made answerable. They would send their regular reports to the Governor General, and the Governor General was required to send reports and be answerable now to the Board of Director, but the Board of Director now was held responsible to the British Parliament, and the British Parliament had a separate cabinet level post now known as Secretary of State. He was a member of the British cabinet, the cabinet level post. So with Pitt's India Act you have beginning of the control of British Parliament over functioning of East India Company in India. This went on until July 1858. You have what I would of course unquestionably describe as the War of Independence, the 1857 War of Independence. It's actually a sad commentary on critical appreciation of our history, that the discussion still goes on whether it was a sepoy mutiny or whether it was an uncontrolled just conflagration which went on, and despite all evidences to the contrary, there are absolutely unimpeachable evidences which establish whatever may be the vision of the leaders of 1857, and the vision might have been the medieval vision of re-establishing the quasi-feudal rule with Mughal emperor as the head of state, but the Peshwa as head of government, and like autonomy, different kingdoms, etc., all okay. But it's an undeniable fact that the goal of the leaders of 1857 was liberating India from the clutches of the British. That makes it a war of independence. Plus, this was not just a spontaneous outburst. First of all, on March 23, 1857, that's the date, Mangal Pandey fired at his commanding officer, killed him, rebelled against imposition, that Enfield rifle, and I'm presuming you know that. And then on May 10, 1857, the rebellion of the British Army unit in Meerut. And they killed all British officers, took control of Meerut and marched towards Delhi, reached Delhi. De facto British rule had collapsed. They re-established Bahadur Shah Zafar, the last Mughal emperor, as the emperor of India, and the goal was Firangi ko hatao. It's not also that spontaneous and unplanned. The outburst was very carefully planned. There indeed was an all India plan. There are unimpeachable evidences to it. So I summarily, I make it a point to always mention it as War of Independence of 1857. That it lost. And it won't be wrong to say that actually the vision itself was doomed from the start. That with all due respect and our respect for their sacrifices, the leaders of 1857 had a backward-looking vision, sorry to say. And of course, they were not equipped with modern instruments the way Britishers were, including transport and communication, and telegraph and whatnot. And railways had begun. And British could move armies at a very fast pace from one place to the other. So, however sad it makes me, the fact remains that the War of Independence of 1857 was doomed, unfortunately, from the start. It won't be wrong to say that War of 1857 was doomed from the start. But British rulers are supposed to have learned the right lesson from it. It is then that East India Company itself was dissolved, and India's rule was directly taken over by now the British Queen. This was Queen Victoria then, and she issued what is famously known as the Queen's Declaration, organized a special darbar in Allahabad. This was July 1858, when the Queen's Declaration, Ranicha Jahirnama. This Abad is of course Allahabad. Depending on the context, meaning may change. Sometimes this may be Ahmedabad. Sometimes this also may be Aurangabad. And whatever Bad you want to make it. Avinash Bad. Queen's declaration promised that now Victoria will be the Empress of India, and as Empress of India she will look after Indians the same way she looks after Britishers. The promise is that now Indians also are my sons and daughters. The promise also was not to interfere in religious matters and not to interfere in the affairs of princely states, like over 600 princely states over there. British conclusion was that the explosion of 1857 happened because of these two reasons. Dalhousie adopting the doctrine of lapse, which forced many princely states to repudiate, give up or forego their rule, and their states were swallowed into the British Empire. And imposition of various rules or active role played by British officers in social reform movement was interpreted as having rubbed on the wrong side both Hindus and Muslims in the country. So the Enfield gun with its bullet is like a precipitating cause. So the British concluded. Therefore, Queen's declaration promised that now she is the highest head of state. She was coronated as Empress of India, and the promise is she will look after her people the same way she looks after British people over there. Therefore, in 1860, you have Indian Penal Code. We are going to devote a separate session for understanding evolution of Indian law and modern Indian legal system. But between 1860 to 1892, the most basic laws which create a legal statutory system, they were put in place. 4 laws are considered most basic ones. Indian Penal Code. Then there is Civil Procedure Code. Then there is Criminal Procedure Code. And finally, what is known as the Indian Evidence Act. These 4 create the framework of statutory rule in India. Here we need to carefully understand that this was a statutory rule, not the constitutional rule. When thanks to Curzon's aggressive policies, Bengal was partitioned on communal lines. And fortunately not just Bengal but entire India came together under like Lal, Bal, Pal and Aurobindo. The most firebrand among them being Lokmanya Tilak. And he started writing in a very aggressive fashion in Kesari. Various British rulers charged him for unconstitutional behavior. That he is creating disaffection against a duly established rule. That section 125 of CRPC was there, already there, section 125. Spreading disaffection, it's sedition. The clause is sedition, Rajadroha. And sedition then defined was creating disaffection against a duly established government. That term duly established was interpreted as like constitutionally established. And Tilak, the father of Indian unrest, this is a name given to him by Valentine Chirol. He used the term as a pejorative term. It actually turned out to be an honor for Lokmanya Tilak. It's like Churchill describing Gandhiji as that half-naked fakir. For him, The term half-naked fakir also was supposed to be a pejorative term that turned out to be an honorific for Gandhiji. The thorough gentleman and the British gentleman that Churchill was, very always careful about his clothes and dress code for a given occasion. When he saw Gandhiji step into British Parliament with only pancha, Churchill was like besides himself with anger. He couldn't stand it. So he had described Gandhiji as that half-naked fakir. That became an honorable word for Gandhiji. How selfless, how simple like. So that half-naked fakir. Similarly, British rulers had appointed this one-man commission, the Chirol Commission, to come into India, study why disaffection is spreading among Indians, why Indians are not happy with the British rule. Valentine Chirol's conclusion is, only one person is responsible finally. That is this Bal Gangadhar Tilak. He called him father of Indian unrest. This was meant to be a pejorative. In fact, legally some serious action was supposed to be taken against Lokmanya Tilak, but that became an honorific, an honorable word, father of Indian unrest. So when Tilak was indeed writing very aggressively against the British rule, there was an accusation against him that you are also spreading disaffection against a duly established government. Tilak's argument was, who says this is duly established government? This is not duly established. That you conquered my country with the might of the sword, and you are also ruling my country with the might of the sword. This is not a duly constituted government. There is a fine Marathi editorial written by Lokmanya Tilak. The title of that editorial is Sanadच नाही तर sanadशीर कुठे. Sanad would mean constitution. So if you are saying that what I am doing is unconstitutional, we don't have a constitution. So where is the question of unconstitutional behavior? Tilak has argued, mind you, that the Britishers conquered India with the might of the sword and continue to rule India with the might of the sword. Tilak goes on to say that this is my country and I have every right to use whatever means on hand to drive them out. I am going to use all those means to drive them out. This is how Lokmanya Tilak also becomes the first person to formally demand written constitution. That we want a constitution and we want responsible government. 1905. Tilak codified his demand that we want constitution. And the term responsible government would actually mean modern democracy based on universal adult franchise, one person, one vote. That people will elect their representatives who will then go to the assemblies and articulate people's wishes and form requisite laws, etc. to govern the society. So we want the constitution. Step by step also, as the pressure went on increasing, as Indian National Congress was formally established, December 1885, Alan Octavian Hume took initiative. He was asked to take initiative by the conservative, die-hard anti-India, imperialist Viceroy by that time. By the way, it just slipped a small part, really. When East India Company was dissolved and the British Queen became the ruler of India, so the Parliament would look after India affairs, the post of Governor General also was abolished. Now, the highest British ruler in India came to be called as Viceroy. The last Governor General went on to become the first Viceroy. This was Canning. Canning was Governor General during War of Independence of 1857. Beginning with the Queen's Declaration, he, the same person, but the title given to him was now Viceroy. Now this is not just a change in the name. The change indicates a significant change, that it's not now a company, a joint stock company that rules India. It is now the British Parliament that rules India. And so the highest administrative head in India will now be answerable to the Parliament. Of course, the Secretary of State. His confidential report, the confidential report of the Viceroy will be written by the Secretary of State sitting there in London. that system started, that small but important for understanding evolution of modern constitutional pillars that had somehow like slipped. I thought of like completing that and then coming back to our ongoing point that Tilak is among the first ones to demand written constitution and responsible government. But even Tilak's approach has evolved through Dadabhai Naoroji and Gopal Krishna Gokhale. So while this conservative imperialist Viceroy Dufferin got Alan Octavian Hume, the ICS officer, who had sought voluntary retirement and decided to spend rest of his life in and for India, he had fallen in love with India. So Dufferin summoned him and he said, as it is, if you have decided to spend your life for, why don't you bring all Indians on a common platform, create a political organization which should which should claim to represent all Indians, which will fight for political rights of India, and it is through that you should submit your demands to the British rulers. So there are two theories behind establishment of Indian National Congress. One is called the safety valve theory, that Dufferin got Alan Octavian Hume to create Indian National Congress as a safety valve. That people's unrest should not go on gathering strength until it bursts out. Let's create a safety valve, which is a formal arrangement for people to express their unrest or discontent. You submit your charter of demands. But this is only one of the interpretations. Another one, of course, is growth of modern Indian nationalism. The awareness that we are all one and that we are being ruled by aliens and we need to fight, organize and fight against them. That brought like Surendranath Banerjee and Dadabhai Naoroji and Sarvajanik Kaka and Mahadev Nyayamurthy Ranade and Vijay Raghavacharya and Ananda Charlu there in Madras, etc. So, December 1885, original decision was to have this meeting in Pune, but a late outbreak of cholera mandated last minute shifting of the venue, the closest one available with the capacity to organize such a public gathering on this scale was Mumbai. Therefore, the meeting happened at Gavalia Tank in Prabhadevi on December 28, 9, 30, 31st, and Congress was created. It's barely original 85, less than 100 of like senior, predominantly like advocates, barristers, the higher middle class, who sat together. But this is how a political institution, a modern political institution was born. First phase is of course called the moderates phase, a belief in politics of petitions. And it's not like it resulted in entire failure. There are some successes. For example, between 1885 to 1905, earlier Royal Service Commission was created. The system of competitive exams was introduced, but Indians did not have entry into Indian administration. It is 1892, with these petitions from moderates within Congress, that Indians began to get entry for the competitive exams so Indians could become ICS officers and have Indian share in ruling of India. Gopal Krishna Gokhale, one of the finest economists, would very carefully watch the British finances. And like earlier, Dadabhai Naoroji and Justice Ranade had exposed the exploitative nature of British rule, both of them, which becomes a contributory factor for economic nationalism in India. Gokhale went on to hold the British rule in India on a short leash. He was a member of the Privy Council. Privy Council is like informal, not yet called the Parliament and also not yet called the Cabinet. Privy Council were selected few people who sat as the highest authority. Privy Council was headed by Viceroy. And the system of presenting our budgets had started. system of presenting a separate railway budget also commenced then, because railways used to have a disproportionately high allocation, therefore separately. Gopal Krishna Gokhale's speeches on budget, on Indian economy, taxation, education are like historical speeches, and he was so respected that even the Viceroy used to make it a point to attend his speeches in Privy Council. When the budget would be presented, Viceroys would be interested to know what Gopal Krishna Gokhale wants to say. So even the demand for having constitution and responsible government, it's not like Lokmanya Tilak as an individual came up with this stroke of genius. All these people are strokes of geniuses. It's a collective evolution. You can say Lokmanya Tilak becomes one of the finest advocates of it, one of the finest spokespersons. But he presented this demand around 1905. Then as the 20th century begins, the pace of constitutional developments increases. So here is the Morley-Minto reforms of 1909. They come close on the heels of Vangabhanga movement. We would do well to remember that as of 1909, Vangabhanga was not yet withdrawn. Morley was the Secretary of State then. Minto was Viceroy. So the reforms are known as Morley-Minto reforms. This is a beginning of partial and even introductory system of representative governments. That Indians can be selected to provincial councils or even the Privy Council. But defining feature of Morley-Minto reforms is separate electorates for Muslims. Partition of Bengal had not yet been withdrawn. We would do well to remember that partition of Bengal was eventually formally withdrawn in 1911. It is then that the British rulers decided to shift the capital from Calcutta to Delhi. Otherwise, please remember that until 1911, Calcutta was the capital of British rule in India. It's only 1911, the Viceroy was Hardings, at whose procession armed revolutionaries threw a bomb. Rest is history. 1911. So 1909, Vangabhanga still stood, mind you. The attempts to fracture Indian society on communal lines and ensure that Muslims become upholders of the British rule rather than the scare, the artificially created scare, the British contributed scare that Muslims as minority in India will be swallowed by this ocean of Hindu majority within no time. So create a rupture. Morley-Minto reform came up with this defining feature of separate electorates for Muslims. When you look back upon the developments, this actually becomes a seminal event which finally resulted in bloodbath and partition in 1946, and actual partition but bloodbath beginning with 1946, and eventually partition as an inevitability. There are other sessions when we will pay our attention to it. But separate electorates, we need to be very careful about the wording. So I'm not using the term reserved electorates. I'm using the term separate electorates. Reserved would mean territorial constituencies were reserved for a given scheduled caste or scheduled tribe. Candidates will have to belong to that community, but voters may belong to all communities. That is not the British scheme under Morley-Minto reforms. Separate electorate means Muslim voter will vote for Muslim candidates. Separate electorate therefore means that for a Muslim candidate to become politically powerful, all he needs, he or she, all he needs is a base in Muslim community. All he needs is to gain confidence of the Muslim community. He need not go after Hindu vote, because his getting elected doesn't depend on Hindu vote. This is a nurturing ground for eventual extremism and extreme positions and communal and fanatic positions. Morley-Minto reform is an enabling provision for it. Another thing that separate electorate also means, to say the least, is that the strength of Muslim vote doubled, because every Muslim person gets 2 votes. See the British skill. The Muslim voter gets to vote for Muslim candidate. Okay? He also gets to vote in the general election for rest of the candidates. Which means, for a Muslim leader to emerge leader, the Muslim leader doesn't have to secure and gain confidence of non-Muslim, especially Hindu society. But for a non-Muslim political leader, especially Hindu again, predominantly, to win the election and develop a political base, that leader will have to gain confidence of the Muslim voter. And there are many constituencies in which a Muslim vote could play a role of a swing vote. Swing vote, that if Muslims vote in a particular fashion, they will begin to dominate. Please remember, this is a seminal and an introductory which went on to, this is a poisonous seed which eventually grew and hasn't yet ended. So partition was just a midterm stop in form of Pakistan, in form of increasing radicalism in Bangladesh, in form of the global phenomenon called Islamic terrorism. We still have those remnants which still continue to challenge. But within Indian setup, Morley-Minto reforms created this. What also saddens me is that the Lucknow Pact of 1916 formalizes the arrangement by Morley-Minto reforms. 1909-10. This is a time when all those possible elements or leaders or organizations, powerful ones, who could have opposed Morley-Minto reforms, were behind bars then. Lala Lajpat Rai was facing life imprisonment. Bipin Chandra Pal, surprising thing, had left India, never ever to come back, and he was there in London. Lokmanya Tilak was suffering at Mandale. Aurobindo, after his initial aggressive participation in freedom struggle, claimed to have seen Sri Krishna and Vivekananda himself, that they told him to now devote himself to spiritual undertaking, adhyatmic undertaking. He was no more there in freedom struggle. The only elements left to still speak were moderate elements. Among the moderates, Gopal Krishna Gokhale raised his voice against Morley-Minto reform, and especially separate electorates for Muslims. But his was a feeble voice. His was like the moderate voice, and so he did make right kind of voice, but nobody, of course, listened to it. And then this, according to me, a tragedy. And Narhar Kurunkar, one of the greatest thinkers, states so, that Lucknow Pact, wherein annual session of Congress and Muslim League was held together, formalized the arrangement for separate electorates for Muslims. This turns out to be a fatal mistake in terms of being able to maintain the territorial and national unity and integrity of India. Eventually the partition. Everyone knows that the goals of Lokmanya Tilak and Muhammad Ali Jinnah until then used to actually think of himself as Tilak's disciple, mind you. And the political ideas also were kind of hazy. Please remember. It's important to remember that until after 1947, Indian National Congress is not a political party, it's a political platform. And a political platform which also is better described as an umbrella structure which found place for all ideologies. All right, left, middle, left of the center, middle of the center, like Hindutva exponents also and communist socialist exponents all found a place in Indian National Congress as long as the goal was political rights of Indians, which step by step developed into the demand for dominion status first, formally. This was by Lokmanya Tilak as a part of Home Rule League. And then eventually the demand for complete independence, finally the India Independence Act of 1947. So Indian National Congress was a political platform. Muhammad Ali Jinnah was a responsible member of Indian National Congress, and still he was a member of Muslim League, and he could still be the president of Muslim League. There was no watertight compartment, mind you. Like later on, Kanhaiya Lal Munshi and couple of others like established Hindu Mahasabha. It's important to remember that for a long time Hindu Mahasabha also was a part of Indian National Congress. Madan Mohan Malviya, Pandit Madan Mohan Malviya and Kanhaiya Lal Munshi, the founders of Banaras Hindu University, on seeing the rise of Muslim communalism in India, these two responded by creating Hindu Mahasabha. But it was not a watertight compartment, and Hindu Mahasabha as established political party which would separately contest religion. That was not the idea. So like Indian National Congress was understood as the platform of all Indians. And there was not either or. That comes into being beyond 1927. Otherwise, until then, this was hazy, the borders were fluid, and one could be member of both or more than two political outfits and still be committed to the political rights of Indians. That is the background of Lucknow Pact. And everyone knows that the main goal was to create Hindu-Muslim unity. That if the British rulers want to drive a wedge, let us defeat their design by having the national mainstream of freedom struggle and by trying to make Muslims as a part of national mainstream. So while the goals are lofty, historically speaking, Lucknow Pact actually ends up by formalizing and perpetuating the arrangement under Morley-Minto reforms. Then enter the First World War. Lokmanya Tilak's release from Mandale, and he came back and he said, I will pick up where I left off. This was a time when Annie Besant had started Home Rule League in Madras. The concept of Home Rule was picked up from the Irish struggle for independence. Just before 1914, the Irish freedom fighters and the British rulers had come together and agreed upon a formula whereby Ireland could become a self-ruled part of the British, that is United Kingdom. But it would be self-ruled, home rule. That idea was picked up. And Annie Besant started the home rule movement in Deep South, that is centered around Madras. The moment Lokmanya Tilak picked it up, it became All India movement. The demand, formal demand of home rule was what is called as dominion status. Vasahatiche Swarajya. The word indeed is Swarajya, one of the four Chatussutris. Swarajya, ever so powerfully upheld by Lokmanya Tilak, also backed by, please remember, Dadabhai Nauroji, eventually Mahadev Nyayamurthy Ranade also, and Gopal Krishna Gokhale also, but Tilak made it into Chatussutri: Swadeshi, Swarajya, Bahishkar, and national education, Rashtriya Shikshan. Chatussutri as the principles on which Vanga Bhanga movement and the further national movement developed. Everyone again knows there are ample even documentary evidences to show that Tilak's main goal was complete independence. But as a great thinker, philosopher and activist, he was also a very shrewd politician who knew one of the best definitions of politics is an art of the possible. Politics is an art of the possible. So the political leader, with whatever is his or her vision, has also to take into consideration what all is possible, how to make it possible. So Tilak calibrated his political demand and summarized it and defined Swarajya as dominion status, Vasahatiche Swarajya. This is the exact demand of Home Rule League. Dominion status means that India, for all practical purposes, will be a sovereign, independent nation state. Will also be entitled to be member of various international organizations as an independent nation state. But the British king or queen will be the highest head of state for India. This is the exact definition of dominion status. Hold it in your mind, because if I'm not going to be able to finish the subject today, which is all okay. As it is, my plan shows that there are 3 reserved sessions. So one full will certainly can't be finished. We are actually going to take a break over here, part 1, dominion status. I'm going to close by just reminding you that please remember, if you don't, you are going to be shocked. In tomorrow's lecture, we will continue with this and understand the evolution of Indian Constitution in pre-independence days. In fact, the more effective parts begin with Montagu-Chelmsford reforms. And I have just begun to explain the background of Montagu-Chelmsford reforms. We'll continue tomorrow. But like I said, the Lokmanya Tilak's demand was dominion status. Home Rule League's demand was dominion status. In less than 30 years to follow, the demand emerged to be complete independence, mind you. Indian National Congress also formally demanded complete independence in 1929. Okay, so now please remember, if you don't know, get ready to be shocked. And also get ready to listen to the further part tomorrow. That what we describe as India's independence on August 15, 1947 is as per the India Independence Bill 1947. India Independence Bill 1947 was passed in the British Parliament. Now hold your breath. India Independence Bill 1947 describes creation of 2 dominions under the British Queen, king or queen. 2 dominions under the British king or queen. So please remember that its actual constitutional meaning is, with all the struggle for independence, what happened in 1947 was de facto, we accepted dominion status. Our true Independence Day is January 26, 1950, and we'll continue tomorrow. But Winston Churchill, the die-hard imperialist, was still sitting there. FDR was generally full of respect for India and particularly full of respect for Gandhiji and what he thought of as a very unusual freedom struggle based on principle of non-violence and satyagraha. So he was keenly watching India. So after Atlantic Charter was finalized, FDR questioned Churchill, is right to self-determination applicable to India? And Churchill just ruled it offhand. His famous quip is, I have not become the Prime Minister to preside over the liquidation ceremony of Queen's empire. I am quoting verbatim.